All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back for week two of public budgeting and finance. Hope everyone had a good week one to the semester, and we are already in week two. So, again, these types of hybrid courses go by so quickly, if they're pretty much over with before they even begin. So, just keep in mind, we're going to be wrapping things up in about 6 weeks, and it'll be over and done with. So, but I hope you had a chance to reflect on what we talked about last week in terms of the course and the course requirements and all those good things. Thank you very much for posting your introduction. I've gone through and reviewed all of those. Again, those are ungraded, so you won't get a grade for those. But your first graded beach board essay is due then next week, next Monday. And for that first beach board essay, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be following the link that I provide for you in the discussion board, and then reading the governor's original proposed budget, state budget from January, the May revision from May, and then the final adopted budget from earlier this summer, and identifying two priorities that you see in the January budget, and then how those priorities change as a result of the May revise, as they've now been incorporated into the enacted budget. So two priorities and how they change as a result of the May revise. One of the nice things for California this past year is that the May revise was a very positive document. A lot of years, what will happen is you'll have these very ambitious programs that will be proposed in January by the governor's office. Then you'll have a May revise, and the May revise will say, we're running behind in our revenue projections. We're not generating as much revenue as we originally thought. And then you have to scale back some of those priorities. This year, we were actually running ahead of our projections, and we were generating far more revenue than we thought we were going to be able to generate, which then allowed the governor's office to increase some of those proposals and even increase the expenditures more than what he had asked for in January. And it was a very positive May revise. We've had a positive May revise for a couple of years now, which is surprising for a lot of folks because the traditional thinking, the conventional wisdom was because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we would end up losing revenue or end up running behind our revenue projections. That's been the complete opposite of that. And so I won't talk much more about it because I want you to be able to go to that link and read those documents yourself and come to your own conclusions about the two main priorities and how they changed after the May revise. So that is then due for Monday by midnight. So make sure you get that turned in. Again, I encourage you to respond to a classmate, but again, my primary focus is going to be on your response to that initial prompt that I have provided. So that's where we are in terms of our assignments. I know I've gotten one or two pre-instructional assignments already, and I've looked at those and provided some feedback on those. The question in text here, are we asked to read the entire budget? No. And when you go to that link, you'll see that there's a budget summary that's provided. And so just use that budget summary and pull out two of the priorities you think are most important and talk about those two priorities. So no, you don't have to read the entire budget summary, kind of the overview that's provided. Sure, my pleasure. Good question. Yeah, budgets can end up becoming very lengthy documents, but they are prospective documents that kind of tell us how we're going to spend our money, how much money we're spending, and what we are spending that money on. And that's one of the things I want to talk with you about tonight, is to get started with our introduction to public finance and budgeting and talk about what a budget is, what a budget isn't, and how we're going to define budgeting in this class, and then talk about what it means for having public expenditures. Because when we identify a good or service as something that needs to be produced and provided by the public sector, we have public expenditures. The more public expenditures we have, obviously, the larger our. And here in this class, we are dealing with public budgets, but in the MBA program, you have a budgeting class where you would deal with private sector budgets and corporate budgets. So we're going to highlight some of those differences and why we have public budgets, why we have public expenditures, and kind of get us started with the idea of the budget process in the public sector. We'll see how long that takes us tonight. Our entire discussion about budget processes, that's a long discussion, and so we'll see how much time we have tonight, whether or not we should get into it tonight, or hold off on that until our session next week. But we'll see how long this discussion of public finance takes us. So before I get into the substantive material for the evening, are there any questions anyone has, or anything you need clarified about the course or anything like that? Okay. All right. If we are good to go, then let's start talking again at the very basic level of what is a budget, since this is a budgeting course. And when we think about budgets, again, they are prospective documents. And so they're documents that tell us this is how we are going to spend our money, how we plan on spending our money in the upcoming fiscal year. At the very basic level, a budget is a statement of dollars and cents. It's a statement of expenditures. Here's what we're spending our money on. Here's how much money we are spending. But for our purposes in this class, we are going to go to a deeper level with budgets. Instead of just talking about it being a statement of expenditures, for us, a budget is going to be a statement of societal priorities. When you're doing public budgeting, you have a finite, limited amount of resources, but you're always being presented with an infinite amount of demands. We always hear the old adage from people who are campaigning, from candidates, do more with less. Well, achieve more with less resources, achieve more outputs with fewer inputs. So when we have these finite resources and we have infinite demands, it means we have to make choices. And the choices we make will be our priorities. And so in a given year, we may prioritize education in the state budget. And we'll put more money toward K through 14 education, or more money toward higher education with Cal States and the UC system. That may be our priority. And in putting more money toward education, chances are we're going to be putting less money toward another expenditure area. So we make choices in budgets. And so the budget becomes a really nice microcosm of the priorities of that society at that given point in time. So priorities about how much money we are willing to spend. Who's going to be doing the spending? And so is this money that's going to be spent directly by government agencies with direct administration? Or will this be grant money? So the money will be given to nonprofit organizations, or perhaps even entities in the private sector, and the administration then becomes much more indirect, where it's government providing the resources and then the nonprofit or private sector actually producing the good or service. So who's actually going to be spending the money? For whom? Who are the beneficiaries that we are prioritizing? So if we're prioritizing K through 14 education, clearly our primary beneficiaries will be students, perhaps teachers, administrators, those who are dealing with that K through 14 education on a daily basis. We'll probably have secondary level of beneficiaries as well, whereby the families of those children will certainly benefit. You'll have tertiary beneficiaries, where you will have companies that will benefit from the supplies that are being provided to make education possible. So those primary, secondary, and tertiary beneficiaries answers the question of for whom. So who's benefiting from these priorities that we're establishing in our public budget? And then obviously what we focus most on is on what? What types of programs, what types of policies are getting an increase in expenditures this year as compared to those programs and policies that are getting a reduction in their expenditures and their appropriations. And we'll talk about the differences between appropriations and expenditures when we talk about the budgeting process. So we're going to frame the public budget as a statement of societal priorities. And whenever you do that, you really raise the prominence of the budget beyond just being a financial document. Now, again, it gives us insight. It's a microcosm of what we believe in and what we prioritize as a society. So it's a statement of priorities, and usually a statement of societal priorities in the case of a public sector budget. Now, as we said, you do budgeting all the time. Corporations do budgeting. You do budgeting in your personal everyday life. We do budgeting in government agencies. Elected officials do budgeting. So why public budgets as opposed to private budgets? And we know there is a tradition in this country of deference to the private sector. It's the whole Adam Smith, the invisible hand of the economy. that where possible, typically, if we can turn it over to the private sector, we're usually predisposed to turn it over to the private sector. So there must be some justifications for why we don't turn provision and production over to the private sector, and why we maintain that provision and that production in government in the public sector. So why do we have public budgets? Why do we have public expenditures as opposed to leaving it to the private sector? As I'm sure you know from your undergraduate economics courses or from your 518 course you've had in this program, one of the main reasons why we have public expenditures is the presence of market failures. So tell me, what is a market failure? When we say a market failure, what do we mean?
The market doesn't produce what the buyers need in the time or at the price that they're looking for.
Exactly, yeah. There's some good or service that is deemed necessary by society, something that society needs. And the private sector just simply does not produce it. Either the private sector chooses not to produce it, or simply for purposes of logistics cannot produce that good or that service. When the private sector chooses to not produce or cannot produce, then we have what is called a market failure. When markets fail to produce or provide something and it's needed by society, then there's a perception that government should then get involved and it should become a public expenditure funded within an ever increasing public budget. Again, market failure is not a pejorative term. There are just some things that the private sector would just choose not to produce or choose not to provide. If it doesn't produce a profit, if there's no bottom line, there's really very little reason for the private sector to get involved in provision and or production. So government then steps in to try and fill that vacuum. In some instances, it's difficult for the private sector to produce it. You know, they may be interested in producing it, but it is cost ineffective. It's just the costs are too high that it prohibits them from being able to do it and turn a profit. So you think about something like mail delivery. You know, yes, we have private corporations like FedEx and UPS and all these other private companies that do package delivery and do a good job with package delivery. When you get to everyday mail service, the cost of FedEx or UPS to try and get involved in everyday mail delivery is just cost prohibitive for them to be able to do so. And also, when you read the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, one of the enumerated powers of Congress is to establish post offices. And so there is that constitutional role that the U.S. Postal Service has in Article 1, Section 8, that, again, makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for private sector companies to enter into that market. So if they choose not to produce or they cannot produce, you end up with a market failure, and government then steps into that to try and fill that vacuum to provide and or produce the good or service that society deems it needs. So that's one reason for public expenditures and public budgets. Second reason for public expenditures and public budgets is this idea of externalities. And you're probably very familiar with the idea of an externality from your economics courses. An externality is an unintended consequence. So we set out to do one thing, and in doing that one thing, we then end up doing something we did not intend to do. So there are positive as well as negative unintended consequences that can occur. Classic example is a negative externality, a negative unintended consequence of something like pollution. So as economists will tell us, you've got your very well-functioning widget factory located up on the hill. And the widget factory is in the business of producing the highest quality, lowest cost widgets possible. And they do a great job of producing a very high quality, low cost widget product. But in producing those widgets, at the same time, they are unintentionally polluting the river that runs behind the hill. Well, there's really no monetary or fiscal incentive for that corporation to go and clean up that pollution. It's negative because it has a negative impact on society. And so since the corporation doesn't have any incentive to reduce the production of those widgets or clean up that pollution, they're going to keep producing those widgets as long as people are buying them, irrespective of the associated cost of that pollution that they are creating, however unintentional it happens to be. So things that produce negative externalities, things that produce things like pollution, tend to be overproduced because companies are not going to take into account the cost of pollution to society in their decision-making calculus for how much they should produce in terms of their widgets. They're going to look at demand for those widgets, the cost of supplying those widgets, and that supply and demand curve will then help them determine how many widgets they're going to produce. They don't really worry about the pollution unless they are forced to worry about that. And so that's where you see government getting involved to try and charge these companies for cleaning up that pollution. And so they try and make companies aware of what these costs are of pollution to society and to the surrounding area. But left unchecked, a good that results in a negative externality will tend to be overproduced by the private sector, which suggests a role for government intervention in terms of regulation. So government will then come in and will then regulate the production of those widgets that are resulting in the negative externality of pollution. But there can also be positive externalities as well, unintended consequences that are good for society. And so you think about the idea of an immunization program. And for years, we've had childhood immunization programs for a variety of different childhood diseases. And we oftentimes have subsidized immunization programs for families below a certain income threshold. So when you are providing those childhood immunization programs, the primary beneficiary of those immunization programs will be those children from those low-income households and those low-income households themselves. But the benefits will then accrue for the rest of society as well, because if these children don't get these childhood diseases, then it's less likely they'll be able to pass along those childhood diseases to other people in society. And so all those other folks in society who are staying healthier because of this program, all those folks are then kind of free riders in that they're getting a benefit indirectly, but they're not directly participating in that childhood immunization program. The problem with a positive externality is that that positive externality, the good that produces a positive externality, tends to be underproduced from a societal perspective. Because all those free riders, all those people in society who are getting this indirect benefit, they are not paying directly for the good that's being consumed because they're not directly consuming it. So if you think about a product that a corporation is producing, they're going to, again, decide how much to produce based upon the consumption and supply and demand. Well, all those free riders are not going to be considered within the demand, though they're not going to have an impact upon the amount of the good that's being produced. So goods that produce positive externalities tend to be underproduced, which then suggests a role for government to intervene in order to subsidize that production to produce a higher quantity of those goods to then, in turn, produce more positive externalities. So whether it's a positive or a negative externality, the presence of externalities really does suggest for us a heightened role for government in the provision and or the production of goods and services. And again, the more government gets involved in provision and or production, the more likely it is that our public budgets are going to increase in scope and the amount of money that we are spending. So we've got some good rationale for why we have government intervention and why we have government provision and production of goods and services, and therefore public budgets. Public budgets they do share some similarities with private budgeting, but there are a lot of differences between the two sectors in terms of how we put our budgets together. So let's look at some of those major differences between public and private sector budgeting. In public sector budgeting, we are usually dealing with a much larger variety of actors. There are more people, there are more groups involved in the budgeting process, and those groups all have these different vested interests. They have their stakeholders that have different interests in the process, and oftentimes these vested interests are going to come into conflict with each other. So it creates a lot of conflict having all these different variety of actors. This really fits very well with a theory that's a very famous theory in public administration that I talk about in a lot of my classes. And that's this theory known as the ecology of public administration by John Gauss. And you may or may not have talked about the ecology of PA earlier on in some courses you had in the program. If you had me for 500, we always talk about the ecology of public administration in the 500 course. But basically what Gauss tells us is if we want to understand public organizations and why the public sector does what it does, we need to understand the environment or the ecology that surrounds that organization. So if you want to understand the budgets that are created in the public sector, we need to understand the ecology or the environment of the public sector. And so John Gauss is essentially what we refer to as a natural systems theorist. And that John Gauss believed that you could look at a public organization as kind of being like a living, breathing organism. And like a living, breathing organism, the primary purpose of that organization is to try and enhance its chances of survival. And so agency survival becomes one of the primary goals, if not the primary goal, of public organizations. But how that organization survives and the steps that organization takes in order to try and promote its survival will be very much predicated upon the environment, the ecology that surrounds it. So if you think about it, liken it to a house plant, if you want to try and predict how a house plant is going to grow, you have to understand its environment, the amount of sunshine it gets, the amount of fertilizer it gets, the amount of water it gets, where it is placed in a room. Some people say how much you talk to the plant. All those aspects of the ecology, the environment of that plant will then contribute or detract from its future growth. Well, it's the same type of thing with public agencies. So when we think about public budgeting that goes on in government, we think about that public budgeting as being very much affected by all the different people and all the different groups who are involved in that budgeting process, whether they be elected officials who are actually making the budgets, to budget analysts like what you have in the Congressional Budget Office or the Office of Management and Budget at the national level, or in the Legislative Analyst Office and the Department of Finance here in the state of California, whether it be interest groups who are very vested in the process, whether it be the courts, whether it be mass media. This all makes up that ecology or that environment of public budgeting. And it's a much larger and much more diverse ecology and environment than what we have usually in the private sector. Secondly, in the public sector, obviously, we are dealing with citizen money. We're dealing with public taxpayer dollars. That means there needs to be heightened accountability and transparency. And that means that we have to abide by sunshine provisions. And so that's why in public budgeting, we have things like required audits, and we have to do audits, either performance-based or management-based audits. Oftentimes, we also have citizen oversight committees. I served on a school board for several years, and we had a bond issue that we passed back in 2014. It was what was called a Prop 39 bond issue. A Prop 39 bond issue here in California means that the school district can pass a bond with only 55% of voters. Usually it takes you 2/3 of voters, but you only need 55% approval to pass the Prop 39 bond. So it makes it easier to pass one of these bonds and borrow money as a school district. But in exchange for that, you also then have to set up a Citizen Oversight Committee, or a COC. The Citizen Oversight Committee will then review all the spending that goes on with all the projects being funded by that bond, and will make sure that all the money is being spent in the way in which it was supposed to be spent. And so they make sure that you're not spending money on projects that were not approved by the voters whenever this bond was approved in the relevant election. So that's an example of this heightened transparency, this heightened accountability that government agencies are held to in terms of spending their money. Another aspect of accountability that we oftentimes see in public budgeting is the presence of what we call restricted funds. And so some of the funds that agencies have to spend will be unrestricted, some will be restricted. Unrestricted funds, that's money that you can spend for the general operations of the government. You kind of have unfettered access to spending that money. So that's where the money comes for things like salaries and benefits and all those good things to keep your agency running on a daily basis. But then you also have some restricted funds. Restricted funds that come from the federal government, that come from the state government, sometimes come from the county government. And you have some very strict restrictions that you have to abide by in how you spend that money. Again, to use education as an example, some money comes in from the federal government in terms of Title I, Title II, Title III, and Title IV funds. Title I through IV funds in education are considered to be restricted funds, which means you are limited in how you are spending that money. So in some instances, that money must be spent on Title I schools based upon the demographic breakdown of the student body at that school. Some of that money, like I believe it's Title IV money, has to be spent on technology for teachers and training teachers in technology. So you've got certain things you have to spend that restricted money on. And again, we do that because it's taxpayer money. We have to open up the doors and let the sun shine in to make sure that the money is being spent the way in which taxpayers want that money spent. Another big difference is how we plan out our expenditures. We tend to plan our expenditures in the public sector very far in advance. And one example of that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks is the creation of a capital improvement plan. So those capital expenditures where we are spending money on things like building a new building or purchasing a new fleet of police vehicles, those very high price tag, long lifespan items are what we call capital items. They're capital expenditures. Those capital expenditures are planned out very carefully in a multi-year capital improvement plan. And typically a capital improvement plan will be a 5-year plan. And you'll plan out all your capital expenses in years 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we tend to plan these expenditures very far in advance in the public sector. We deal with a lot of limitations and constraints in the public sector in terms of the amount of money we have and how that money gets spent. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One example of constraint that's very germane for local governments is the limitation on the amount of property tax revenue that cities can generate. We're all probably familiar with Proposition 13 that was passed by the voters back in 1978. It strictly limits the amount of property tax revenue that local governments can charge, or can generate, because it will limit the tax rate to a 1% property tax rate and will limit the amount that the value of property can increase from one year to the next to no more than 2%. You combine a rate limit with that assessment limit, you have a special type of limitation called a property tax revenue limit, and that's what we have with Proposition 13. So what Proposition 13 did in 1978, by limiting the amount of revenue that a city could generate from the property tax, it then forced that city to look elsewhere for revenue. And that's when cities started to look more toward user fees and user charges, non-tax sources of revenue to diversify their revenue portfolio because of the limitations they were faced with Proposition 13. So that's one example. Also here in California, we have what's called the GAN appropriations limit. And so as local governments, we are limited in how much money we can spend based upon how much we spent in the preceding year. And so we can only spend a certain percentage more than what we spent last year. That's a constraint, that's a limitation on the amount of expenditures we can make in a given year, the GAN appropriations limit. So again, just a couple of unique types of constraints and limitations that we face here in California that local governments in some other states may not face in accordance with their own individual state laws. We obviously have a lot more scrutiny in public budgeting. We're dealing with taxpayer money, and so everything we do will be scrutinized very, very closely. Taxpayer groups will be very interested. The mass media will be very interested. In many respects, the courts will be very interested. Again, to give you an example, here in California, we have a type of funding known as CFD funding. It stands for Community Facilities District. And so when you have a developer coming in that wants to develop a new neighborhood, that new neighborhood, when it is developed, will put a strain on the existing infrastructure in that area. So when you build all these houses, the people who live in these houses will probably have kids. Those kids need a school to go to. Well, if all your other schools are full, you're going to have to construct a new school to accommodate the kids from this area. There'll be a requirement for fire protective services, especially in high wildfire risk areas. So you might have to build a fire station in order to accommodate that, and so on and so on. So to pay for all these infrastructure improvements, you create this thing called a community facilities district. When you create that community facilities district, you generate tax money out of that district in order to pay for all these infrastructure improvements. But there's actually a group here in California that maintains a website that monitors these community facilities districts. And if you're interested in if any community facilities districts exist within your city, this organization provides a list of all the what we call CFDs, when they were created, the amount of revenue that they are generating, the amount of debt that they have issued. That's a lot of scrutiny of that type of a financing source. We have our open meetings law here in California. We have a Brown Act. And so your city council meetings, your school board meetings must be done in the open. The public must have the opportunity to participate and make comments at those meetings. You have to post your agendas in 72 hours in advance. There are limitations on when you can do special meetings, limitations on what you can do behind closed doors in closed session, as opposed to what you must do in open session out in the public. Again, that's all for more scrutiny in the decisions we're making in how we are spending public taxpayer money. So, and again, that's just not a laundry list, but just some highlights of some of the major differences we tend to see between public sector budgeting versus private sector budgeting. But get back to the idea of a public budget and why we have public budgets and why our public budgets tend to be relatively large. The reason why our public budgets tend to be relatively large is because of how we categorize goods. The more goods we consider to be what we call public goods, the more likely we're going to leave that to the public sector and will be paid for in public budgets. The more goods that we consider to be private sector goods, the less likely it is that we'll have government intervention in the provision and or production of those private sector goods, and therefore the smaller our public budgets will be. So in this class, we're going to focus on 4 major types of goods: public goods, private goods, toll goods, and common pool goods. So at the opposite end of the spectrum, on one side you have pure public goods, on the other side you have pure private goods, and then that gray area in between you have what we call toll goods and common pool goods. How we categorize a good, it's either being public or private or toll or common pool, depends upon the 2 factors of exhaustion and exclusion. So this is how we categorize our goods. So the first categorization is by exhaustion. Can that good be used up? So does one person using that good, consuming that good, use it up for someone else? Can it be exhausted? If so, then those 2 individuals are rivals for that good. So you think about something as simple as a candy bar in a convenience store. You and I walk in the convenience store, there's one Three Musketeers bar on the shelf. You're younger and more agile than me, so you get to the Three Musketeer bar first, you purchase it, you consume it, it's now gone, it was the only one, it's been exhausted. That's a private good type of characteristic. Contrast that to something like national defense. So we all get a benefit, we derive a benefit from having a strong national defense. Some people may derive a more of a benefit from national defense than others. But the benefit I get from knowing we have national defense does not erode any benefit you can get from knowing we have national defense yourself. So my benefit from national defense does not exhaust your ability to benefit from national defense, thus making it more of a pure public good. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't contract with military contractors for a lot of the implements that we use in the production of national defense, but the overall provision of national defense tends to be public, paid for by public taxpayer dollars, tends to be non-exhaustible. Then you also look at excludability. Can you exclude people from partaking in the benefits of the good? Obviously, with the private goods, you can't. So you go back to your Three Musketeers bar. There's a price you have to pay for that Three Musketeers bar. If you don't pay the price, then you don't get to purchase it. You don't get to consume it. You are excluded from consuming that Three Musketeers bar. That again is a private sector element. And so that Three Musketeers bar is a private good. It is exhaustible and it is also excludable. You can charge people for the benefit they are deriving from consuming that candy bar. So that makes it a pure private good. So therefore, we leave that to the private sector. You don't have government creating and manufacturing candy bars. They will regulate the safety of candy bars to make sure it doesn't harm the public, but you leave the production, the provision to the private sector. There are some things that are much more difficult to charge people for. So you go back to a pure public good like national defense. I may get a great benefit from national defense because maybe I fear that Canada is going to invade down through Washington, Oregon, and take over California. I have this irrational fear, and so I get a great benefit from national defense. You don't share my irrational fear, so you get a little less of a benefit. But I don't have to pay more just because I'm more paranoid than you are about the hostile intentions of the nation of Canada. So it's difficult for you to charge people commensurate with the benefits that they are consuming with a pure public good. So non-excludability, non-exhaustibility argues for a pure public good. Exhaustibility and excludability argues that it's a private good. So again, public goods, you can't exhaust or exclude. Private goods, you can exhaust them and you can exclude people from partaking in the benefits if they don't pay the price that's being charged. Those are pretty easy to discuss and compare because they're on those opposite ends of the spectrum. Pure public over here, pure private over here. Where it gets a little bit more difficult is when you get into that gray area of goods that have some private elements, yet some public elements. And so those are examples such as toll goods and common pool goods. Toll goods are really easy to understand is that a toll good is just like a toll road. So you pull up to that toll road, the bar is down. If you put your money in, you pay the toll, the bar goes up, you can drive on the road. And so you can charge people, you can exclude people who didn't pay the toll from driving on the toll road. So it is excludable, but it's not exhaustive in that if everybody pays the toll, eventually everybody will be able to drive on that road. You may have to wait for the car in front of you to get out of your way, but eventually you pay the toll, you'll be able to drive on that toll road. So toll goods, you cannot exhaust, but you can exclude. Common pool goods are the opposite. With a common pool good, they can be exhausted, but it's difficult, if not impossible, to exclude people from partaking in the benefits of a common pool good. So think about something like natural resources or mineral pool rights, something like that. It's difficult for you to exclude people from partaking in those natural resources, but they can be consumed and used up. And so if someone uses them up, it's not then available for someone else to be able to use. So I just recommend to you, these are 4 different types of goods, and how we categorize things into those 4 categories will help explain whether or not we want to fund them as a government and put them in their public budgets, or do we want to leave their provision and or production to the private sector. The more goods you consider to be public in nature, the larger your public budgets become. The more things you consider private in nature, the smaller your public budgets become in both size as well as scope. So keep those 4 different types of goods in mind because they will help explain for us which sector does the provision, which sector does the production. Obviously, the more things you consider to be private in nature, the more likely you are to engage in privatization. And you're probably all very familiar with privatization. Privatization is when we turn over responsibilities for either provision and or production from the public sector to the private sector. So one of the most common things we do in privatization is obviously contracting out. Sometimes it's referred to as load shedding. We will shed some of the load of responsibilities from the public sector to the private sector by entering into contracts with private sector entities. So when you're constructing that new city hall, as one of your capital projects. You're going to pay for that with public funds. You're probably going to issue debt and then pay for it with your bond proceeds, which are public funds. However, the actual construction of that city hall probably will not be done by city employees. You're going to put out a request for proposals, and then contractors will respond to that RFP. They'll put their bids in. You'll then go through a competitive bidding process. You'll select the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, and we'll talk about all that later on. But you select your lowest responsible and responsive bidder, and then you award the contract to that private contractor, and then they actually do the construction of the facility. So contracting out is normally how we do privatization. Now, sometimes we will privatize on a whole-scale basis. We'll take, for instance, in prison privatization, we will privatize the entire operation of the prison by signing a contract with a company like Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, which is one of the biggest private prison companies in the country. We'll sign a contract with them to come in and operate our state's prisons, whether it be in terms of hiring and training correctional officers, to the food provided, to education provided, all maintenance, all those things will be done by a private sector corporation. So there are a lot of different gradations of privatization. And sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about privatization kind of as a dichotomy. We're either privatizing or we're not privatizing. There are a lot of different levels of privatization. Obviously, we do privatization because one of the main advantages is hopefully we can do it more efficiently. But if we turn it over to a company that does this for a living, so a company that builds buildings for a living, they'll be able to do it in a more efficient and more effective manner than if we had to reassign our city employees and teach them how to build a building. So you get more efficiency and hopefully more effectiveness by turning it over to the private sector. Privatization also can give you more competition. There's a problem sometimes when we have government monopolies, and when government is the only one who provides and produces a good or service, government then sets the price for that good or that service. Sometimes when you have multiple providers and producers of goods and services, you introduce that competition through deregulation, you hopefully will be able to lower prices. The disadvantage, obviously, with privatization is a loss of control. Whenever you turn this production over to a private sector company, they have to abide by the stipulations in the contract, but they're out there doing the work on their own. You will probably supervise, you might have a project manager or a project management company that you'll contract with to watch the construction of that city hall, but you kind of lose that oversight, that daily oversight that you would normally have if you would have kept that process or that procedure in-house within that government agency. So there are pros and cons. The rule of thumb is all the easy things to privatize, like things like trash collection, have already been privatized. We've already privatized all the easy things. Now we're dealing with questions of how to privatize the more difficult things. Trash collection is easy to privatize. You can charge people, you can exclude people. It meets a lot of the requirements of a private sector type of good. Education is a little bit more difficult, K through 14 education. Yes, there can be private schools. Yes, you can privatize some elements, but a lot of governments that have turned their entire educational operations over to private companies such as Edison International and other corporations like that have now gone and deprivatized and regained control of their educational operations. And so, again, something that's a pure private good is easy to privatize. Once you start introducing some public sector elements into that good, it starts creeping more and more toward being a public good. That's when it becomes much more difficult to engage in privatization for the provision and or production of that good or that service. And by now you're probably sick over the past 45 minutes of hearing me say provision and or production. I've been saying that phrase over and over again. I've been doing that for a reason, because there is a difference between the provision of a good or service and the production of that good or service. The provision of a good or service is when we give the resources that will then make production possible. Production is the actual creation of that good or that service. So if you think about something like this class, PPA 555, what we're doing here on Tuesday afternoon/evening, this is production. This is the actual education from the class. The provision, the resources that make this possible are the fees that you pay, as well as the state appropriations that come in from Sacramento. That's all the provision, the resources that then make it possible for us to engage in the production of this class on Tuesday evenings. So for a class like this, our state-supported program, the provision, the resources come from you, the resources come from the state of California. We have a distance learning program that I run as program director. That's a self-support program. So for the distance learning program, the money comes from students. It's a self-support program. We don't get any money directly from the state of California. So we have a different mechanism for provision. So provision is giving the resources. Production is actually creating the good or the service. Obviously, government can do both. You have situations with pure public goods where government both gives the resources, pays for it with public taxpayer money, and then it's government employees who actually do the production, something like direct administration. So if you have some type of a social welfare program, and that social welfare program is being paid for with public taxpayer dollars, and then the individuals who are actually implementing that program, who are actually interfacing with the public and getting checks directly to households, those are government employees who work for the agency. That's public production as well. So there you would have government doing both with that social welfare type of program. Another option is at the bottom, they're all private, where you have private production, private provision. So that would be a pure private good. That would be like the candy bar and the candy bar maker. You can have a situation where you have government provision and private production. That's the contracting out that we had discussed, when government will enter into a contract with a private sector corporation to actually create that, create that city hall. The money that pays for that contract will come from public taxpayer money. The actual production is being done by a private contractor. The reverse of that, which we don't see all that often, and there are a whole lot of great examples, is private provision and government production. This is kind of a rare occurrence in public budgeting. One possible example, and Mike Sell, I believe, uses this example, is if you have a concert, and you have a concert promoter, and that concert promoter wants to have security done for that concert. So the concert promoter will then hire the local police department to come in and actually do the security at that event. The provision is the money that's coming from the concert promoter, so it's private money. The production will be done by local police officers, so it's public production. But again, that's kind of an unusual situation, and not a lot of great examples other than that of private provision and government production. So typically we have the government doing both, we'll have the private sector doing both, or we'll have government provision and private production. Again, depending upon how we have categorized that good, whether it's pure public, pure private, or falls in that gray area of total or common pool good. So it all depends upon how many public versus private elements those goods have. So it's important to keep that in mind, this whole distinction between provision and or production, because we're going to keep going back to that distinction throughout our entire class and highlighting that again. So again, keep that in mind. That's the reason why all night I've been saying provision and or production. The other complicating factor with public budgeting is that public budgets are public in nature, and public budgets represent public decisions. But we are all private individuals. So the question is, how do we get from our private decisions, our private individual wants, needs, and desires, and translate those individual wants, needs, and desires into a macro level public document like a public budget? How do we choose between these priorities? Because by definition, some people are going to benefit and some people are not going to benefit. Some people are going to have their wants, needs, and desires incorporated within the societal public budget. Some people will not. And so how do we choose, I hate the phrase winners and losers, but how do we choose winners and losers in terms of what we put into our public budgets. But we know it's not a summative process. We know it's not as easy as just taking everyone's individual wants, needs, and desires, adding them all up, and then that becomes your societal public budget. It's not that easy because one person's wants, needs, and desires will then cancel out another person's wants, needs, and desires. It goes all the way back to James Madison. If you remember reading Federalist Paper number 10, which you probably read in your PPA 500 course, in Federalist Paper number 10, Madison talks to us about factions. And he tells us that democracy will naturally create factions, groups of individuals who want different types of things. When you have these factions that are created naturally by a democracy, these factions are going to come into conflict with each other. That type of conflict is natural to a democracy. You can't get rid of that conflict. You cannot get rid of those factions, because getting rid of those factions, getting rid of conflict, means getting rid of democracy. But the best we can hope to do is to try and balance ambition against ambition, balance one faction against another. And that's what we do in the creation of public budgets. We balance one faction against another. Some factions will see what they want in the budget. Some factions will not get what they want in the budget. But it's not as easy as just adding everything up. We have to have what we call choice models to make these difficult decisions about whose preferences and whose desires end up in the budget and whose preferences and desires do not end up in that budget. So a couple of different choice models that we can consider in translating private decisions into macro societal level public budgets. One choice model that's been around for a very long time is what's called the Pareto optimal model. And you probably run into the Pareto optimal model before. The Pareto optimal model says that the right choice to make is the choice that benefits at least one person without harming anyone else. So it's the program that will benefit at least one person, but will not make anyone else worse off, will not harm anyone else. Those are the types of decisions that need to be made. Those are the types of programs that would then find their way into a societal level public budget. But we know that's not realistic. If you've had the policy class before, the 670 course, you've probably talked about different types of policies. In American public policy, we tend to have three main categories of public policies. We have distributive policies, whereby they benefit people and no one else gets harmed, because you're just distributing resources directly to people. No one's actually paying the cost of it. No one's being harmed with that type of distributive policy. Doesn't happen very often in our policy making. The much more common type of policy we have in American policy making is a redistributive policy. In a redistributive policy, we are redistributing wealth and resources from one segment of society to another segment of society, which means by definition, there will be some winners and there will be some losers. So you think about tax cuts. Whenever you have tax cuts, that's a redistributive policy. You are giving tax cuts to one segment of society, but not another segment of society. And that's a segment of society that's not getting the tax cuts probably will end up paying for those tax cuts and will be harmed, at least initially, by those tax cuts. You think about in terms of a social welfare program that only benefits people under a certain income level. Well, those people under that income level will benefit from that social welfare program, but the other taxpayers are paying for that social welfare program. Now, you can argue certainly there are positive externalities to that program that will accrue to those individuals, but at least initially they are being harmed. And so that would be excluded from a Pareto optimal choice model. A more contemporary example, I guess, could probably be the idea of student loan forgiveness. And student loan forgiveness, you have an income threshold that's been established for that $10,000 student loan forgiveness. And so those underneath that level get the forgiveness. Those above that level do not get the forgiveness. Those who have already paid off their loans or who never went to college and took loans are not getting the $10,000 of forgiveness. And so that would violate this Pareto optimal model. And that's what the vast majority of our policies are. They're redistributive types of policies. And then the third type of policies you probably know are regulatory policies, but the ones that we're most interested in are those redistributive policies, because having a redistributive policy, redistributing wealth from one segment of society to another, would violate the Pareto optimal model. So you can never make a public budget if you only relied upon the Pareto optimal model. Fortunately for us, though, there is another economic choice model that allows us to have public budgets and allows us to redistribute wealth and resources. And that's that third model, that second model you see up there on the screen, the Kaldor-Hicks choice model. In the Kaldor-Hicks choice model, the beginning is the same, that a choice is worthy of being made. A program is worthy of funding in our context if it benefits at least one person, but those who are harmed will eventually be compensated. So it allows you for people to be harmed initially by this program or this policy you are funding in your public budget, as long as eventually they will end up being compensated. So an example of the Kaldor-Hicks model in budgeting, if you go back to trickle-down economics, the supply side and trickle-down economics in the Reagan administration. Trickle-down economics were predicated upon the idea that if we provide tax cuts to upper income Americans, then upper income Americans will take that additional money they have as a result of those tax breaks, and they will funnel that money back into the economy. So they will create businesses with that money. They will hire people from lower income strata into those businesses and give them jobs and reinvigorate the economy. And basically the benefits would then trickle down from the wealthiest Americans down through all of your income strata throughout your entire economy. That's permitted by the Kaldor-Hicks model, because those lower income Americans who are not getting those tax breaks initially will eventually benefit with a stronger economy, with more businesses, with more available jobs, and ostensibly higher wages. So that's how you get those types of redistributive programs in your public budgets, is through this Kaldor-Hicks model. It benefits at least one person, but those who are harmed will eventually then be compensated. If you think about the major tax cut, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I think it was called, in 2017, that was predicated on the same idea of this Kaldor-Hicks model. You give the tax break to upper income Americans and to corporations, who will then use the money to reinvigorate the economy and allow the benefits to trickle down through all income strata. So most of our budgets are made up based upon this Kaldor-Hicks model, that we make our choices, we make our decisions about what gets included in the budget through a Kaldor-Hicks model, that even though everyone doesn't initially benefit, those who are harmed or those who are not receiving the benefits initially will eventually get some benefit as a result of this program or this policy that we are funding in our public budgets. So that's kind of how we get from the individual level of a person's wants, needs, and desires to the macro societal level of a public budget. So we've already said that public budgeting is distinctive from the private sector because of the number and variety of actors who are involved in the budgeting process. So let's just very briefly look at which actors are involved and what types of vested interest those stakeholders have in the budgeting process. And then we'll return to this when we get into our full-blown discussion of the budgeting process, either later tonight or may hold off on that for next week. So who are some of the major actors in the budgeting process? Obviously, bureau chiefs. And when we say bureau chiefs, we're talking about the heads of agencies and departments. The heads of agencies and departments will put together their budget requests. They'll submit that budget request to a central budget office. Usually at the federal level, what will happen is the heads of agencies and departments at the federal level will submit their budget requests to the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget will review those budget requests, will then make changes to those budget requests, and then the modified requests will become part of the president's budget. Here in the state of California, you have the heads of state agencies and departments will put their budgets together, and then those state agencies and department heads will then transmit those budgets. The Department of Finance will then go into the governor's budget to then be passed on to the state legislature for approval. Now, those heads of agencies and departments have a vested interest, and their vested interest is in protecting the survival of their agencies. And so what oftentimes happens is when they put their budget requests together, they will engage in what's called budget maximization. So they may strategically misrepresent the amount of money that they need in order to ask for more money than they actually need so that they can enhance the prospects of survival for their agency. So it's not unusual for a budget chief or a bureau chief or an agency head to say, well, it looks like in my estimation, we're probably going to need at least 2% enhancement of our budget to continue our current level of services. So let's ask for 5%, knowing that there's a good chance that the Executive Budget Office, whether it be OMB at the federal level or Department of Finance at the state level, will probably cut that request back. So we'll ask for more, hoping to then get a cutback to what we actually need. So there is a lot of that strategic type of misrepresentation because bureau chiefs are trying to argue for the benefit of their agencies and their departments. The Executive Budget Office, whether it be OMB or Department of Finance, they're usually there to represent the interests of the chief executive. So OMB serves the president, the Department of Finance serves the executive branch in California, the governor's office. So they will be there to try and support the policy initiatives of the chief executive, which oftentimes will run headlong into conflict with what the bureau chiefs are trying to do. So you have a lot of that conflict in terms of their vested interests. The chief executive obviously is an important actor in the budgeting process. At the federal level, as well as in the vast majority of states, we have what we call executive governed processes, where the budget process is really driven by the chief executive. The chief executive starts the process, the chief executive puts together the executive budget, and will frame all the questions that the state legislature or Congress will then consider throughout the formulation process. So typically, we usually see the chief executive being very powerful in the budgeting process and trying to promote their individual policy goals and individual policy aims, trying to live up to all those campaign promises that they made in order to get elected chief executive to begin with. You have legislative leaders. And so you have your leaders in Congress, you have your leaders in the state legislature. In Congress, you have leaders obviously such as the Speaker of the House, minority leader in the House. In the Senate, you have the majority leader, the minority leader, President Pro Tem in the Senate. You also have whips in both majority and minority whips in the Senate as well as in the House. You have chairs of budget committees, chairs of appropriations committees, chair of Ways and Means Committee in the House, chair of Finance Committee in the Senate. Same type of arrangement that you have also in California with your gang of five in California who are very much involved in the initial stages of setting budget priorities. At the federal level, you have the importance of budget committees. And so in the House and the Senate, there is one budget committee in the House, one budget committee in the Senate. That's where the president's budget starts. And the president will deliver their budget to Congress in February and immediately goes to the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the federal process. You also have an Appropriations Committee in the House and Appropriations Committee in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will have 12 different subcommittees that deal with different areas of spending. And so legislative committees, legislative subcommittees are very, very important in the public budgeting process as well. And then obviously you have interest groups. Interest groups are really very much involved in making sure that their pet projects and their programs find their way into the federal budget process. So they spend a lot of time and a lot of money lobbying members of Congress. Same thing in Sacramento, a lot of money and a lot of time lobbying state legislators. At the federal level, most of these high-profile lobby groups are found on K Street. And so if you see a lobbyist referred to as a K Street lobbyist, that's going to be kind of your upper echelon of lobbyists that are registered to lobby with Congress and oftentimes have a lot of sway in terms of what actually ends up in that federal budget. And then more and more today, you have the courts who are involved. They oftentimes don't think about the courts as having much of a role to play in public budgeting, but they actually do. And that courts have become very active in engaging in what are referred to as structural remedies, where a court will issue a structural remedy and an order to a state government or to a federal agency requiring them to take a certain type of action that will then cost them money. in abiding by that structural remedy and taking that action that's being ordered by the court, obviously that agency is going to have to spend money to do it. So it's going to have a budgetary impact upon that agency. And not to belabor it too much, but a good example of that was the state of Missouri several years ago. The Missouri State Supreme Court decided that there's inequality in K through 12 education spending. And so they ordered some districts in the state of Missouri that were spending the least on their students, the least amount of revenue per student, that they would have to spend more to come up in accordance with the average in the state of Missouri. That was an order that was given to the school boards. The school boards then had to increase their tax rate in order to generate more money to come up to that average amount of spending to come into compliance with that structural remedy. Well, the problem for a lot of those school districts is at the time in the state of Missouri, in order to increase tax rates, you had to have the approval of 2/3 of voters in that jurisdiction. Obviously, that's a very high standard to meet. And a lot of school districts were unable to come up to get a tax increase passed with a 2/3 majority. They might get 50%, but they're not getting close to a 2/3 majority. And so the Supreme Court came and said, well, for every day that you do not pass a tax increase and spend more money, we are going to fine you as a district and fine you as school board members. Again, that has very profound budgetary implications for those school districts. That's an example of a structural remedy and some of the heightened involvement that we have seen from both state as well as federal courts in the budgeting process. So we have this ecology of budgeting whereby we have a lot of different actors involved and a variety of actors who come at the budgeting process with a lot of different vested interests and different things that they're trying to accomplish that oftentimes run counter to each other, which makes the budgeting process a very conflictual process and makes it very difficult for us to get our budgets done on time. What has resulted then is that a lot of members of the public view budgeting in a very negative light. And we hear it all the time where they would say, well, we are going to, I'm not going to participate in the budgeting process. I don't trust the budgeting process because the budgeting process is all political. So let's deal a little bit with this whole idea of the politics of the public budgeting process. And Katerina asked a really good question in text chat. Would they just close the schools then? They were constitutionally prohibited from closing the schools because they were required to maintain an adequate system of public education. So they were really in a catch-22. They couldn't close the schools. They had to continue operating, but they had to pay these fines to the court because they weren't able to increase their tax rates. Eventually, Missouri then carved out an exception for school districts, so they didn't have to get a 2/3 majority. They only had to get, I think it was a 55% majority, which then eventually made it easier for those school districts to increase their tax rates and therefore spend a little bit more money per pupil. They could privatize, and some schools did try and privatize. Privatization in education has really run the gamut. Some districts went and completely did a whole-scale privatization where they turned the entire operation of their districts over to a private sector company like Edison International is one example. There's a city in Massachusetts that turned their entire school district over. There's Minneapolis schools, as a matter of fact, many years ago, turned their entire operations over to a private corporation. That's whole-scale privatization. Some districts have tried that. Other districts have done a more limited type of privatization where they would privatize things like transportation services. So they no longer have district-owned buses and district employee bus drivers. They turn it all over to a private transportation company and pay a contract to that company. Some districts have privatized cafeteria services as more limited type of privatization. And so some districts have their instructional aides are coming from private corporations. Some districts have had so much trouble hiring speech and language pathologists that they have contracted with private companies to hire private sector speech and language pathologists because they can't hire them as district employees. And so we do see a lot of privatization. Typically, it's the more limited variety where you're privatizing transportation or cafeteria or individual employees, as opposed to turning the entire operations of the school district over to a private education company. But that is obviously, that's a great point. That is one option for school districts that they have availed themselves of. So the budgeting process, a lot of people say, well, it's just too political. Too political for me to be involved in. It's too political for me to trust, too political for me to support. And we hear about the politics of budgeting all the time. So we have to really deal with this issue of when people say budgeting is political, what do they mean? Well, there could be a lot of different definitions of what they mean by the politics of budgeting. Sometimes when people say budgeting is political, they're talking about all the reform attempts that we have tried to initiate over the years to make our budgeting process work more efficiently and more effectively. When we go through our discussion of the budgeting process in the near future, we will highlight some of those major budget reforms at the federal level. The Budget Empowerment Control Act in the 1970s, the Graham-Rubin-Hollings 1 and 2 in the 1980s, the Budget Enforcement Act in 1990s, the Balanced Budget Acts throughout 1993 and 1997. We have tried again and again to try and reform budgeting. And a lot of those reforms have ended up being a failure. Whenever we try and reform budgeting, we often try and reform it so that we can avoid deficits and so we can get our budgets done on time. And all those reforms I just mentioned, as you'll see in a future discussion, all fail to accomplish those two main objectives. So usually the failure of reforms, it's political. They're just trying to gain political points by trying to reform budgeting. Sometimes when people complain about the politics of budgeting, they are frustrated with the incremental nature of budgeting. Budgeting typically tends to be done in incremental fashion, which means very small changes in your budgets from year to year. So we usually base next year's budget on what we spent this year. We'll take what we spent this year, we'll then increase it by maybe 2 or 3% to try and keep up with the increased cost of living, but we don't make any major fundamental changes to the programs and the policies that we are funding in our public budgets. And that frustrates people because things tend to always stay the same, irrespective of the success or failure of those policies and those programs that we are funding within our budgets. So they really don't like this incremental nature to budgeting. And they have a point because budgeting is very incremental, very small changes from year to year. Some people will bemoan the role of interest groups. And they'll say, well, interest groups are too enmeshed. They're too involved in budgeting. And so the lobbyists that have the money, the lobbyists that have the access, they're going to get their programs and their policies in the budget. Those individual citizens who don't have that type of access or those types of resources, they're not going to be able to have any impact upon the budget and the budgeting process. Again, sometimes when people say budgeting is all political, they're bemoaning the process itself. The process is a very slow process and it's a very complex process, especially at the federal level. We have a lot of members of the U.S. Senate who have served in the U.S. Senate literally for decades, for 30 and 40 years. Even those senators who have served in the Senate for 30 or 40 years will admit that they do not understand all the intricacies and the nuances of the federal budget process. Because what we have done over the years when we have reformed the federal budget process, we have overlaid new procedures on top of existing procedures, and then overlaid new procedures over those procedures, which are overlaid upon existing procedures, and so on and so on. It's kind of like the income tax code. The income tax code now is thousands upon thousands of pages long with all kinds of loopholes that most people don't understand what those loopholes are. It's because we pass laws that just add on to previous laws. And that's what we've done with our budgeting process, making it so complex and so convoluted that even those 40-year veterans in the Senate will admit that they don't understand everything about the federal budget process. When you have a very complex process like that, you end up spending more money than you should be spending. And we'll talk about when we do the federal budget process, we'll talk about things like omnibus budget reconciliation acts, the way in which we usually put our budgets together every year, and why those omnibus budget reconciliation acts have led us to a lot of excessive pork barrel spending that we would not have done if we had just followed the normal process as laid out in federal law. And then finally, when people talk about the politics of budgeting, they talk about those actual policy debates. So if there is a policy or a program that they would like to see incorporate in the budget, but it doesn't make it into the budget, well, it didn't get in there because it's all political, because I don't have the political wherewithal. I don't have the political resources in order to get my policy or my program into that public budget. The problem is that budgeting, again, there are always going to be winners and losers. And individuals who don't have the resources and don't have the access are going to be really turned off by the process because their policies and their programs and their motives, their incentives, they're not going to end up in the public budget. The public budget is going to represent those who have the access and the resources to get their policies and programs into that public budget. So there's a lot of discontent among the public about how governments do their budgeting processes. The irony about that here in the state of California is that because of the Brown Act and our sunshine laws, the budgeting process here in California, especially at the local level, is one of the most transparent processes in the entire country. In that you have to hold public hearings on your budget, you have to post your budget in advance, you have to solicit public comments on your budget. You typically will have budget stakeholder groups that you will create made up of members of the public that will advise you on the budget and give feedback on the budget. You have interim budgets, first interim budgets and second interim budgets before your final adoption of your budget. It's a very, very transparent process. But despite that transparency, you still have a whole lot of distrust in how public taxpayer money is being spent by elected officials and government agencies. But budgeting is all about making decisions. Let's go back to the very beginning of what we started talking about tonight. The budget is a statement of societal priorities, where we have to make decisions about what we prioritize and what we do not prioritize, what we're funding and what we are not funding. So we make decisions all the time when we are putting together a public budget. And there are several different clusters of decision making that occurs in public budgeting. We have to make decisions about revenue. So we have to decide how much revenue we need to generate and where that revenue is coming from. Essentially, who's going to bear the burden of paying those taxes? So should we use taxes that are based upon someone's ability to pay? So people who are from higher income levels will have to pay a higher percentage of their income in taxation than those from lower income levels. Should we choose a form of tax revenue that is more equal, such as a benefit-based tax, like a consumption-based tax? The problem there is that benefit-based, consumption-based types of taxes tend to be regressive in nature. That if you have a sales tax placed upon all commodities transacted within the jurisdiction, people with more income have more wealth, have more disposable income, and therefore they have more income left over after they pay for staples of life. And so sometimes those become very regressive taxes. But how much revenue we have to generate, where that revenue is coming from, who's paying that tax burden, those are those types of revenue-based decisions that we have to make. We have to make procedural decisions about how we're going to put that budget together. So who is going to be involved in budget creation? What's their role going to be in budget creation? How much can we allow the public to be involved in budget creation? We're going to do some community-based type of budgeting where we actually go out there and hold our focus groups and our town halls and allow people to participate directly in putting the budget together. Are we going to use performance-based measures in our budget? Are we going to just use an incremental approach? So we make decisions about processes. Obviously, we make decisions about expenditures, what gets more money than what else, what we're going to fund versus what we're not going to fund. Another decision-making cluster, we make decisions about balance. How important is it for us to balance revenues and expenditures? How important is it for us to avoid running a deficit? Well, obviously, at the federal level, it's not very important at all for us to avoid a deficit, because we have run a federal budget deficit every single year from 1969 to 2022, with the exception of only 2 years. There have only been 2 years we had a budget surplus on paper. Every other year, we have run a budget deficit. So clearly, balance is not a very important consideration at the federal level. It is a much more important consideration at the state level. State governments will usually have a part of their constitution, a provision that will preclude the state and local governments from running a deficit, where you must balance your revenues and expenditures every single fiscal year. So it's much more important, obviously, at the state level than it would be at the federal level. But we have to make those types of decisions. Not all deficits are bad. Not all debt is bad. And we'll talk about that when we get into a discussion of debt and deficits when we talk about capital budgeting in a couple of weeks. Then we have to make decisions about implementation. Yes, decision makers, elected officials, put together the budget, but then that budget then gets apportioned out to state agencies and federal agencies, and then it's up to public administrators, the bureaucrats, to actually implement those budgets and actually spend that money. Even though we have appropriations that tell us how money needs to be spent, there is still a good deal of flexibility, especially with unrestricted funds, in how we spend that money. So during the fiscal year, when the money is being spent and the budget is being implemented by bureaucrats, there are a lot of decisions that those bureaucrats will be making on a daily basis in terms of where that money is going. Here in the state of California, we'll talk more about it in the budget process, but we have kind of an unusual process whereby the state legislature will pass the state budget. They need to pass it by June 15th, need to be signed by the governor by June 30th for the beginning of the new state fiscal year on July 1st. However, there aren't a whole lot of details in that budget when it's signed by the governor on June 30th. A lot of the details in terms of where the money is being spent and the requirements for who gets the money and how much money they get, a lot of that is embodied within what we call trailer bills here in California. So throughout the month of July and August and into September, the state legislature will be busy passing these trailer bills that will actually govern how that money is to be implemented, how those programs will be implemented, how that money is actually to be spent on a daily basis in those state and local agencies. So just because the budget is done at the end of June doesn't mean that there aren't more decisions to be made as that budget gets implemented in that fiscal year. So since we're making all of these different decisions, whether it be in the revenue cluster or the implementation cluster or the expenditure cluster or the balance cluster or the procedural cluster, we need to have some good models that we can rely upon in terms of how we make those decisions. So you may have run into these decision-making models in a previous class, but in this class, we're going to focus on 4 different models to help us make decisions in public budgeting. The first model is the rational comprehensive model that I'm sure you're very familiar with. In a rational comprehensive model, we identify clearly our goals and our objectives. We then go out there in a rational manner and collect all the possible information that is out there to generate a full range of alternatives for achieving our goals and objectives. We will then compare all those alternatives, select the best alternative, and that best alternative, that best program or that best policy then becomes part of our public budget. We then put our money where our mouths are, and we then fund that quote unquote best policy or program. Obviously, the good thing about that is you are being rational, so you're taking into account all the information that is out there. But we know that we're human beings. And as human beings, we have cognitive limitations. We have time restrictions. So there's a good chance we're not going to be able to access all the information out there to put together a full range of programs and policies that we can then choose from in what we are going to fund in our budget. We have what Herb Simon refers to as bounded rationality. As human beings, there are boundaries placed upon just how rational we can be. And so instead of being able to be rational all the time in our budgeting, we tend to be more incremental, which is our second decision-making model. So rather than collecting all the information out there and selecting the best alternative solution, the best policy or program, we will instead be incremental. We will look at what we did last year, and we'll use that as our guide for next year. So what we did last year, we'll add on 2 or 3%. That'll become our budget for this year. The next year will then be 2 or 3% more than what we did this year, and so on and so on. It's what Charles Lindblom referred to as the branch approach to decision making. And if you remember to your 500 class, Charles Lindblom told us about the root and the branch approach. The root approach was rational and comprehensive. The branch approach, the much more limited approach, was incrementalism, and incrementalism is the decision-making model that is typically used in public budgeting. The good thing about incrementalism is it's much quicker and it's less resource intensive than rationality. It's a lot more practical and pragmatic. The disadvantage, though, is that if you have a program that is not working, you're going to continue funding that program year in and year out under incrementalism. You're going to keep repeating those same mistakes every single year. And you'll never have occasion to go back and holistically think about these programs to then replace inefficient programs with more efficient ones. But that's usually how we do our budgeting, primarily incrementalism. Those are at polar opposites of each other. Rational comprehensive is on one side of the spectrum, incrementalism on the other side of the spectrum. In between rationality and incrementalism is a third decision-making model, which is called mixed scanning. Mixed scanning is when we are rational for big issues and incremental for small issues. So if we have an issue such as we're going to construct a new recreation center that's going to cost our city $70 million, that is arguably a very big issue. So we want to be as rational, comprehensive as we can possibly be in making that decision, because not only is $70 million a lot of money for a city, but that recreation center is probably going to be with us for generations, for decades, if we maintain it well. So it's a very big, momentous decision. So we want to take into account as much information as possible. However, if we're making a decision about the amount of staples we should buy for our office next year, that's a much more mundane, small decision, so it can be more incremental. We look at how many we bought last year, then make a small adjustment to it, and that will then suffice for this fiscal year. So big issues, you're rational. Small issues, you are incremental. The problem with that is what is one person's big issue may be another person's small issue, and vice versa. So there's a lot of subjectivity in terms of determining what is a big issue and what is a small issue. The fourth decision-making model, which I like a lot because I think we use this one a lot in policy making and in public budgeting, is this idea of a garbage can model of decision-making. Now, I hate the name garbage can model of decision-making because it kind of leads you to believe you just throw everything in a garbage can, you mix it up, and then what you get is what you get. There's actually a lot more rhyme and reason to it than just that. In garbage can model of decision-making, we tend to make our decisions at the confluence of four different what are called streams. The first stream is what's called the participant stream. So in order to make a big change in policy or to make a big change to what you're putting in your public budget, you need to have the quote unquote right people in decision-making positions. You have to have the right participants. Participants, decision makers who are predisposed to making a big change. Some decision makers are very much resistant to change. They just want to keep the trains running on time. They're kind of what we call the brokers. They're not really interested in making any big changes to the vision of the government or the city. You need to have people who are there who are willing to risk things and willing to make big changes. And when you have those people in decision-making and budget-making positions, then you've got what's called the participant stream in place. Then the second stream is the problem stream. Most of our programs and policies, if not all of them, are designed to address a problem that has been identified in society. So in this decision-making model, you've got this stream of all these problems that are floating around out there that we kind of know about, but we have to somehow pick one of those problems out of that stream to then try and make a decision about it and fund the program or fund the policy to address it. So when you've got a problem in that problem stream that people can agree upon, that yes, this is the problem, this is why we have the problem, this is why it is important, then you got your problem out of your problem stream. Then your third stream is your solution stream. And this is where this decision-making model differs from rational and incrementalism. Rationality and incrementalism, they're very linear types of models in that you identify the problem and then you generate a solution and then you fund that solution in your budget. In garbage can model decision-making, solutions can actually predate problems, in that there may be a solution that we generated for a different problem 50 years ago that would work for this problem today. So we reach back and we take that solution and we apply it to a contemporary type of problem. A great example of that would be something like a block grant. Block grants were developed decades ago, but when we did welfare reform in the 1990s, we replaced categorical grants with block grants. We didn't create these block grants in the 1990s. They're the same type of block grants we used in the 1940s and the 1950s, but we chose a pre-existing solution to address a contemporary problem. And then the fourth stream is what we call the choice opportunity stream. It's kind of a window of opportunity that galvanizes public opinion around the fact that we need to make a change to the way in which we're addressing this problem and the types of programs and policies that we are funding in our public budgets. So you've got the participant stream, the right people in place. You have a well-defined problem that people can agree upon the problem definition. You have a solution, oftentimes a pre-existing solution that could be used to address this problem. And you have the public on board that, yes, it's time to apply this solution to the problem. That tends to be when you get big changes in your public budgets and your policies. I would argue that the vast majority of our public budgets are done using incrementalism. It's evidenced by the fact that most of our public budgets are line item, simple types of budgets. However, every now and then we have a glimmer of rationality with garbage can model of decision making. Those four streams come together, and then we have big changes to our public budgets. Again, one great example of that was in the mid-1990s with welfare reform, what was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, where we fundamentally changed welfare policy and started funding a different approach with block grants, temporary assistance and needy family grants within our federal budget. Again, something unlike what we had been doing in the previous year, but something not unheard of before. The use of a block grant is something that we had used for many, many decades in the past. So keep these four decision-making models in mind because they are going to be very useful for us next week when we get into our discussion of budget formats, if time permits. We're going to introduce four different types of budget formats, and we're going to link those four budget formats back to these decision-making models. Some of the budget formats we're going to cover are going to be very rational in terms of their decision-making. Some, like line item budgeting, are going to be much more limited and much more incremental in nature. So this discussion of the past 90 minutes kind of gives us a start into our understanding of public budgeting and finance. It gives us an understanding of why we have public expenditures, why we have public budgets, why our public budgets tend to be relatively large in both size as well as scope, who's involved in the budgeting process, and kind of how we make those decisions about what types of programs and policies get funded in our budgets and who does what in terms of the provision and the production of these policies and these programs, and these goods and services. Rather than going into the budgeting process now, because that tends to be a relatively lengthy topic to cover, if we were to take a break now, we would still only have about an hour left. I don't think we can do that in the hour we have remaining. I would propose that we have an early night tonight and we stop here. Then when we come back next Tuesday, we will devote the vast majority of our time to talking about the budget process. And if time permits, next week we can get into those four different types of budget formats. If not, then we can push budget formats to the following week. But next week will be primarily the budgeting process. Any questions at this point about any of this information we've covered, or class information, or anything at all?
I have a question. Are we allowed to use this information when we're doing the pre-instructional assignment, or should we not?
Yeah, for the pre-instructional assignment, I try not to use it because, again, it's the pre-instructional is kind of supposed to be an initial assessment, and so try not to use that information. Just kind of use what you currently know about budgets, if possible. That's why I think next week the budget format information, I think we're going to push that to the following week, because I would hate to provide that information next week because your pre-instructional assignment's not due until the 12th, and so I kind of want to wait until maybe that pre-instructional assignment is due, and then present that information so that you can just use what you currently know about budget formats to do the assignment. So that's why I think next week we're going to just do budget process.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, good question. Okay, well, again, this recording will be up on our beach board site no later than tomorrow morning, fingers crossed, if everything goes well. And remember, you have your first beach board essay on the state budget that is due then next Monday, and I'll take a look at those when they come in on Monday, and then incorporate into the information we need to into our class session next Tuesday, where we'll devote most of our time to talk about the budget process at the federal, state, and local levels. Thank you very much. Hope everyone has a great night and a great week, and I'll talk to you again then next Tuesday. So take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.